And just one more thing before we get going, fair warning that we're going to record the session so that people who couldn't join us can watch it later. So if you're asking questions, those at the end, those will get recorded too. And I want to say too, please feel free to jump in at any time if you want to ask questions during presentations. Catherine, do we have recording turned on?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. So I think we'll wait just another couple of minutes to make sure everybody's on. Okay, I see a few more people have joined. Maybe we should get started. Well, good morning to those of you tuning in from the States, and good afternoon to our friends at JISC. And thanks to everybody for joining us for this discussion of a pilot collaboration that DLF and JISC have undertaken around aggregating and comparing repository usage statistics. I'm Bethany Nowicki. I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Library Federation at CLEAR. And I thought before we start, we should do maybe a quick round robin of introductions from the CLEAR DLF and JISC side, just so you know who's on the line. From DLF, we have not only members of our staff, but also community members who are involved in our really vibrant assessment interest group, the DLF Aig, and they've been instrumental in this project. But let's start with the CLEAR and DLF staff who've been involved in the project, maybe just to say hello and what your role is in our offices. So Catherine, Wayne, do you want to say hello?
Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Kim and I'm the Assistant Director of DLF.
Hi, I'm Wayne. I'm the Technical Director for CLEAR and DLF.
Thank you both, and also instrumental in this project and in making broader connections between CLEAR and JISC has been Krista Williford, our Director of Research and Assessment, and she couldn't join us today. Let me also turn briefly to the leaders of the DLF AIG for self-introductions. I see Santi on the line. I'm not sure if Sarah is. Yeah, Sarah's here too. Do you two want to say hello, and maybe any other AIG members who are on the line?
Sure. Can you hear me? This is Santi.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Santi Thompson from the University of Houston Libraries, and as Bethany mentioned, I'm one of the two co-facilitators for the DLF Assessment Interest Group. If you are unfamiliar with that organization, in a few slides, I'll be giving you just a really brief background and update on where that group is situated currently. We have lots of varying interests, and I think lots of intersections between what IRUS UK and IRUS USA is developing and what some of these groups are thinking about and working on. So I'll just keep it at that for now. And as Bethany said, we do have some other community members, other participants on the line. But for now, I'll hand it over to Sarah, assuming you have a mic, Sarah.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Rubino. I'm also co-facilitator with Santi of the DLF Assessment Interest Group, and I'm based in New York City at the New York Public Library. I'm really happy to see everyone here today.
Thanks both. And I don't know if there are other AIG members that want to say hi or wait to the end to post questions and comments. Either way is good. Jump in if you want to say hello. Okay, quiet people, but I see you. There's Hannah in the chat. Hello from Hannah in the chat. Okay, well, let me turn now to our colleagues from JISC, whose wonderful IRUS project has been the whole basis of this experiment. And I'll hand it over, I guess, to Hillary or Paul to start introductions of the JISC team members who are on the call.
Hi, I'm Hillary Jones. I work obviously for IRUS UK, and I'm involved with IRUS USA as well. So I'm facilitator, administrator, whatever you call me, everything apart from the technical side.
Hi, I'm Paul Needham. I've been involved with IRUS, well, right from its inception, and when it was just a twinkle in our eyes. I'm involved in various aspects across the whole service, but my primary love is the technical development of the system.
And hi, Dave Chaplin. I work with Paul on both IRUS and IRUS UK, IRUS USA, and primary responsibility for getting all your data loaded into the USA version.
Hi, I'm Ross McIntyre. I'm JISC's Head of Library Analytics Services. So I'm really pleased that we've been able to get this thing sorted out, so we can actually speak to you and get you more engaged, and we're really enthusiastic about it. So essentially, Paul and I begat IRUS together, so we go back a long way, and I hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you all. Thanks everybody. So that was welcome and introductions. And here on the screen now, you should be seeing a little roadmap for the next couple of minutes, in which Santi and I thought we would give you sort of a high-level overview, first of the pilot project itself, and then of the AIG's interest in it, before we spend the bulk of the webinar getting a thorough walkthrough of IRUS with the JISC team. And so what you see on the screen now is a link to the pilot instance of IRUS USA, along with a non-shibboleth login if you want to peek inside while waiting. You will also, though, see screenshots later on in the presentation, so you can follow along that way. And so, so let me just give you the story of the pilot. A little less than a year ago, as a matter of fact, a year ago next week, DLF's parent organization, CLEAR, which is the US-based Council on Library and Information Resources, announced a partnership with JISC, which is the UK's major digital services and solutions provider to institutions of higher learning. And this is an exploratory relationship between CLEAR and JISC around various areas of mutual interest and focus, really meant to enhance, if we can, transnational development of digital libraries and research data repositories, and overall to help make the landscape more collaborative and coherent. And the pilot project that you're hearing about today is the first concrete collaboration in this partnership. And it came about because when DLF joined conversations about potential intersections of CLEAR and JISC work, we brought along Digital Library Federation community members with us. And it was the excitement of members of our assessment interest group that really drove this. And they were excited to learn about IRUS UK and to think through what it might mean to them locally at their own institutions to be able to do real cross-institutional and indeed international comparison of repository usage statistics. And this was most especially in the context of some ongoing DLF Aig projects and projects stemming from the wider DLF community, which Santi is going to talk about in a minute. For my part, what most excited me about undertaking a possible pilot was what the JISC team are doing to promote standards compliant, fully open and non-commercial and increasingly international approaches to repository statistics, how that might align with some of the qualitative and humanistic approaches to assessment that I could see growing in the DLF Aig, particularly in an IMLS-funded project on the transformative reuse of digital library content that you'll hear about in a minute, and also in the work that the AIG's Cultural Assessment Subgroup has been doing on understanding things like the ways that implicit and structural bias impact the selection and aggregation of digital resources in the first place. So that's sort of broad context. So last summer, after some great conversations with our friends at JISC, we drew together a small group of DLF member institutions that were willing to join in the experiment and install the software add-ons needed to have their repositories participate in what might eventually become a US or North American-based sort of parallel and partnering system to the already highly successful IRUS UK. And these institutions that you're seeing on the screen, so the pilot partners include the University of Pittsburgh, Montana State, Indiana, University of Maryland, Houston, and Caltech. And the University of Virginia and Swarthmore College also kindly signed on, but true to the expenditure of any pilot, hit some snags that meant that they're not currently contributing stats to the aggregation. We're also expecting the University of Michigan to join shortly, or perhaps they already have just come in. And Johns Hopkins and the Smithsonian libraries are also evaluating the plugins and maybe joining soon. So that's our small pilot group. And they've come in piecemeal, and it's only now that the system has been running for each of the ones that are in for a goodly amount of time that we can begin to evaluate real results. But of course, everybody's experience in getting into the system, that's part of the results for us too, of the pilot. So we're aiming to conclude this pilot in the summer and undertake an assessment that is help us determine next steps. And so at the end of this this presentation, we'll share some of the questions that are driving us. But for now, I'll kick it to Santi to talk briefly about the DLF Aig and just a few among its many interesting projects.
Well, thank you, Bethany. So as we've sort of discussed before, the DLF Assessment Interest Group is quite vibrant. It has lots of things going on. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to give you all a sort of broad overview of who we are and sort of what are the things that we're currently doing. So broadly, the Assessment Interest Group seeks to engage the cultural heritage community in developing best practices and guidelines for various kinds of digital library assessment. And since our founding in 2014, the DLF Aig has been concerned with probably 4 broad initiatives. First, determining how to measure the impact of digital collections through qualitative and quantitative metrics. Second, developing areas of commonality and benchmarks and how we measure collections across various platforms. Third, understanding cost and benefits of digital collections. And fourth, exploring how we can best collect, analyze, communicate, and share all of this interesting information effectively across our various stakeholders, from collection managers to scholars. So to address these broad areas, we have currently 5 working groups under the umbrella of the Aig who are working on various aspects of assessment. And I'll just give you a sort of flavor of what some of those things are currently. So we have some groups refining a cost calculator to estimate the financial resources needed for a digital project. Another group is developing resources for user experience assessment, including user persona best practices. A third group is planning for a toolkit to assess the reuse of digital library objects. Yet another group is establishing a metadata application profile clearinghouse, which is intended as a community repository for mappings metadata guidelines, and application profiles. And a final group of sorts is articulating a set of values for culturally aware selection practices. And so you can see a pretty diverse set of interests there, and these groups span many types of organizations and countless individuals who are contributing to the efforts. So the work of the AIG Content Reuse Working Group that Betsy mentioned previously is probably of particular interest to the IRUS USA community. This group is currently conducting an IMLS-funded grant project to develop a framework for assessing digital library reuse. We see this as a growing need since traditional library analytics focus almost entirely on access statistics, which are important but don't always provide a nuanced picture of how users are transforming unique materials from library-hosted digital collections or any cultural heritage organizations. So this lack of distinction, combined with the lack of standardized assessment approaches, makes it difficult for institutions to develop user-responsive collections or highlight the value of existing materials. This in turn presents significant challenges for assessing the appropriate staffing, system infrastructure, and long-term funding models needed to support digital collections. So ultimately, the Content Reuse Working Group project aims to do some of the following. First, identify sustainable embedded assessment techniques that can be applied to a broad array of digital library collections. Second, support cultural heritage organizations in deepening their understanding of the ways users engage with, reuse, and transform digital content. And third, with the digital library community, develop approaches and best practices for communicating the economic, educational, scholarly, scientific, social, and cultural impact of digital collections. So this grant project will provide our group with data needed to develop a toolkit for assessing reuse. And such a toolkit will supplement other DLF community resources already in place, like the AIG's cost calculator. This future reuse toolkit could potentially spark future collaborative opportunities with the IRUS USA community and other stakeholders, as assessing usage statistics is one important aspect of understanding digital library reuse. And other working groups within AIG may also have particular perspectives to share with the, with the community. And as co-facilitators for the AIG, Sarah and I will continue to explore the possibilities and keep you all updated as this project moves along. And I'll pass it over to you, Bethany, now.
Okay, thanks. And actually, I think what we're going to do at this point, thank you for that great overview of the AIG, is kick things to the JISC team to give us kind of a deep dive into IRUS and a look at IRUS USA. And so at this point, we could either hand over control of the slide deck to Paul, I think. Would that be the ideal thing to do?
Yes.
Okay, so I will stop sharing
Right.
and let you start.
Well, hopefully you now see slide 6 in front of you all.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, IRUS, short for Institutional Repository Usage Statistics. You can see this slide was lifted straight from an IRUS UK presentation because it starts off by saying a national aggregation service. Of course, that's true for IRUS UK, but the fact that we're all here at the attending this webinar today, clearly there's more than just a national element to this, and although especially in the early years, of course, all our development was focused on the UK, we've always kept an eye out on the wider world and always seen the possibilities of perhaps a network of irises working together to ultimately give international and perhaps even global aggregation of materials in repositories. Primary purpose, especially from the point of view of each individual institutional repository, is to be able to share and expose usage statistics down to the individual item level based on the counter standards. I assume most of you know what counter is, but just briefly, going way back, nearly 20 years back, not quite that far, but close to. Traditional scholarly publishers were all producing stats for their subscribers, for their subscribing institutions, but they're all doing it on their own basis, and it was impossible to compare stats across different publishers. That led to the birth of Counter, which is an organisation with representatives from traditional scholarly publishers, aggregators, other scholarly information bodies, and increasingly in recent years of interest to open access publishers and repositories. It's about time that repositories were able to share stats that are comparable so that we can get a true picture both within nations and across nations. What we do is we collect raw download data from repositories, and that's for all item types within repositories. In the past, Counter was perhaps more focused on books and journals and articles, but there's plenty of other materials out there like theses, conference papers, working papers, and you name it, there's a list as long as your arm of potential item types held within repositories. Once we've got download data from repositories, we then put them through an ingest series to convert them into counter-conformant statistics. We say counter-conformant rather than counter-compliant because true full counter-compliance involves statistics being audited on an annual basis. And although we do produce stats that follow the counter processing rules, until recently there wasn't a mechanism for us actually to produce any of the official counter reports. That will be changing with release 5, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The way we get raw usage data from repositories is using something called the tracker protocol. It's something that we devised in collaboration with Counter a number of years ago and was endorsed by Counter and is can be found in the Counter Code of Practice for articles. It's a very short set of key pieces of data around a usage event get transmitted from a repository to us. So it'll be the date and time of event, what was downloaded, client IP and user agent, carrying out the download, referrer ID and so on. Plus we also collect the OAI identifier, which means we don't, when we get the messages, we don't need to know everything about the item because we can subsequently pick up metadata around an item using OAI PMH. Once we've received raw data, we put it through a pretty rigorous and growing number of scripts as part of routine daily ingests. So it starts from raw data and we then eliminate robots as identified by the robots, counter robots exclusion list. We also apply additional filters on overactive sources of downloads that are unlikely to be genuine human. So we do put that raw data through quite stringent processes before it actually ends up converted into counter statistics. Of course, once you've got the stats into a database somewhere, you then need to get them out, and we do have various ways through web interface, through Sushi, which actually next year will become redundant. That's the Standardized Usage Statistics Harvesting Initiative Protocol. Up until now, that's been an XML SOAP service, but increasingly important is what was called Sushi Lite and will become the new Sushi next year officially, where it's a RESTful-ish API. So you can query the IRUS database by hitting the base URL of the API with appropriate query string attached to it, and it returns JSON to you. Oops, sorry, back we go. There are many uses for IRUS UK. Importantly, beyond providing benefits for individual institutions, that the aggregation of data allows you to do things around the combination of usage from participating repositories. It offers an opportunity to understand the way that IRs are used, and gives institutions opportunities to use and exploit those stats to support their advocacy. You see from the slide, we have over 90% of eligible repositories in Irish UK now, and there are here a series of case studies which show the different ways that some of our participants have used the Irish UK stats for their own purposes, developing materials for advocacy, encouraging use of the repository, combining usage and altmetric data, increasingly popular pastime, supporting open access, reporting to senior management, and of course benchmarking. Just illustrating the point that it's not just a single benefit service. There are benefits in a number of ways to a number of stakeholders. I think that's all I really want to say at this point, and I would at this stage pass you on to my colleague Dave Chaplin, who will walk you through the IRUS USA portal.
Right, let's just get this fired up. Right, hopefully we're all seeing slides at the minute. So, following the advice of WC Fields to never work with animals, children and live demos, we're going to do this with just a series of screenshots to save those horrible gaps where things don't appear to work properly. So this, just to follow on a bit from what Bethany showed earlier on with the username and password, the easiest way into the IRUS USA portal is actually via Shibboleth. And if you see on this slide, there's the portal button in the top right-hand corner. Clicking on the portal to start with will give you 3 choices to log in, the first of which is via Shibboleth. And on the basis that I believe there's a join up between the UK Federation and the US, the majority of US institutions can access via the UK Federation. So clicking on that first button should grant you access. And once you've got access, then this is the view that you will see. So this is just an overall summary of the data that's actually in the IRUS USA portal. Well, these are slightly out of date, these slides, but as you can see, there's 7 repositories in there, and showing the downloads up to January 2018 in this case, and then the few in 2018 in February. And following on a bit again from what Paul has just outlined in terms of the filtering that goes on during the QA procedures, this slide gives a summary of the ingest stats. So you can see for each repository the amount of raw data that we get in, the amount excluded due to the user agents in the counter robots list, the processing that we do on top of that as part of IRUS, and also double clicking activity, and then the actual number of downloads that we consider and ingest into IRUS USA on the right hand side there. Now that was part of the meta statistics views, as we call them. Just under the banner at the top there, you can see five different tabs. So we have meta statistics on the right hand side, then metadata views, of which this is one. And this is showing the item types and how we map them. So we keep a controlled list within IRUS of item types, and any types that are coming in from the repositories we map to one of our designated list of item types. And that way makes it easier to do comparisons over the different repositories. And then we're into the guts of the system, which are the statistics reports. So this enables you to drill down into your repository or other people's repositories and see the downloads over given time ranges. So this is an item report 1, as it's known, which is just the number of successful item download requests. You set a date range for this, as you can see on the screen there, and you can select an individual repository. And that will give a results page akin to this one, where you've got the breakdown there of, as you say, nearly 6,500 results there for Indiana in the period from May 2017 to January 2018. All of the top items there on the table are clickable, so the table can be sorted by any of those columns. And so in this case, if we clicked on total, we would get a rejigged table as shown now. And you can see under total there that the numbers for the individual articles are actually hyperlinked as well. And clicking on one of those would take you through to the item statistics page, where you can actually see the breakdown across months. And actually for the last, I think it's 28 days as well, which is lower down on the slide. Another report there is downloads of theses or dissertations, and as you can see, it's a similar format, and the functionality of the report is exactly the same. And then we've got a repository report as well, in which case we're just going through all the successful item downloads. And in this case, you could the optional parameter is to pick out a particular item type, but by default it will just give all. And this is the results of running that query. So you get a breakdown there across all the months and all the repositories of the activity and the number of downloads that have been collected into the system. So that is a very quick run through of a few of the bits, but I'd encourage you to log in and have a mooch around, and any questions, then we have a help desk. I'm not sure if we've got the address on there, but I'm sure Bethany can push it round. And we'll move on now to the next section, which is where we're actually going with IRUS, and hopefully all the IRUSs once they're all on board. So IRUS UK is obviously the most mature, and one thing we've been looking at in there at the moment is adding visualizations. So on top of the reports that I've just demonstrated a few of, we've pushed the data into Tableau, and I'll just give you a few screenshots of how that's looking at the moment. So this is just a yearly downloads one for a particular repository in IRUS UK, in this case Cranfield, since that's where Paul's affiliated. So you can see the breakdown there of the different item types. So these are the IRUS item types that we map every other incoming type to. So it's very easy from this kind of analysis to see that articles and theses are the biggest hits from Cranfield's repository across the years. Drilling down into the 2017 column on the right hand side, we can break it down even further by month, which just gives similar kind of data. And then, because during the analysis we find we're just doing lots and lots of bar charts, to break it up a little bit, we like to throw in the odd screenshot, the odd visualization involving bubbles. So in this one, it's showing a particular month. So this is December's data. And again, just a different way of viewing the downloads. One other thing we've started looking at recently is actually extracting the country of the requests, so we can obviously throw a map up with that data then showing where the requests to a repository in a given time period And even for a particular item type, we can see where those requests come from. And lastly, the nice, impressive one of IRUS UK, which is the trend over time. So this is showing the number of downloads that are recorded in IRUS UK over the years. And as you can see, there's significant growth there between 2012 and 2017, which is obviously with more repositories joining all the time, but also people using them more and more. So it's all good news. And now I'm going to pass you back to Paul, who's going to run through the rest of the future work for IRUS.
Hi folks, back with you. Thanks, Dave. I mentioned earlier that we had one slight problem with Counter, was that we couldn't actually become Counter compliant because up to release 4, we weren't actually capable of producing any of the official Counter reports, which, as I say, were very much constructed originally based around the idea of subscription services. However, this has been addressed, and over the last 2 years, along with representatives from publishers and repositories and aggregators, wearing my Counter hat, we've been working on the next release of Counter Release 5, which will come into force at the beginning of next year. With Counter 4, or Release 4, the situation has arisen that there was a proliferation of reports. I think it was something like over 24 potential reports, and there were inconsistencies in layout and labeling across those reports. As I say, in practice, repositories couldn't actually produce any of those reports. Now with Release 5, we've done a lot of work to standardize the reports, and we've gone from a couple of dozen reports to 4 basic master reports, which are very comprehensive, sort of platform, database, title, or individual item level. And each of those master reports can have a series of standard views which can be derived from them for specific use cases. And most importantly, there is the item report, which is the one that is the most important for repositories, and we are going to be capable of producing it. So I would encourage any of you that are interested in Counter and what's going on there to Google the Counter website and to have a look at the Code of Practice for Release 5. And at some point, clearly, we will have to be transitioning what the various IRUSs do from the current style into producing Counter Release 5 reports. That will be something that we will be working on over the course of this year. So that's going to be a watch this space and see what emerges in time for January next year. As I said, we get metadata, as Dave said, we get metadata via OAI PMH, and generally across the board we use the OAI DC, the doubling core offering, because it's the only one that's guaranteed to be available across all repositories. However, we are increasingly looking at other metadata schemes. In the UK, we have REOX application profile, which is designed to offer more formal metadata around scholarly articles and has the appropriate elements, making it easy to identify things, including, importantly, an element or an attribute to show ORCIDs. We recently have been starting work on ingesting ORCIDs into our system in the UK, and I hope that this would be possible in the States as well at some point. The advantage of having ORCIDs, as many of you will know, is that you can reliably disambiguate different authors who might have the same name, the famous John Smith problem, or where an author's name changes over a period of time and their affiliation, nevertheless their ORCID will remain constant, and that enables us then to produce reports on a per researcher basis, which is something that's been asked for on and off over the years. And for some now we can do it, and increasingly as we get more ORCIDs in the system, we'll be able to do that more and more. The ORCIDs are actually also useful for funders. And another thing that REOPS allows us to do, where repositories have catalogued the information, is to get details of funders and grants and so on. So at some future point, as and when we identify the best methods of getting funder metadata in, we will also be able to produce reports on a per funder basis, so that various funding bodies that pay for the research that leads to articles that get deposited on repositories, they will be able to see some of the impact of that money that they provided for research. And clearly, as we're all here today, pilot services, we have indeed been doing work beyond the UK, and the IRUS USA pilot is one. We've also got an IRUS ANS pilot going with Australia, New Zealand. We also do provide services for a couple of individual repositories. The OAPEN Library, Library of Open Access Books, hosted in the Netherlands. We produce their stats. We produce the stats for the University of Amsterdam. We have interest from others around the world, including Middle East and all over the place. So we hope that all of these pilot services and the existing service will one day be able to come together and provide us an Uber service, which we lovingly, at least privately, call IRUS Global, but we're open to any labelling of that. I think at this stage, should I pass it back to you, Bethany?
Well, I think there's, can you hear me now? There's one more slide that maybe...
why IRUS?
There's why, well, actually, then there are two.
Okay, right. I think the order in my copy of this has gone awry in some way. Anyway, so why IRUS? Well, I suppose the bottom level for many of us is it pays our wages, but more seriously is the point about being able to produce standardized statistics. Until you know that everybody's stats are being produced on the same basis, you really can't say much above and beyond whatever particular claims you're making for one particular stats system. Beauty of Counter is that the stats are consistent and comparable, and that's the basis then of everything that spins out from the basics of converting raw data into stats. I think for me, one of the important things right from the get-go was not only could we be consistent and comparable across repositories, but we are using the same method of counting as traditional scholarly publishers. And so that opens up some interesting possibilities going forward of aggregating, consolidating stats, not only from repositories, but from publishers one day as well. We spend a lot of time and effort on filtering to remove anomalies, robots, rogue usage. At this point, I should say I'm a member of the Counter Robots Working Group, where we meet several times a year. We discuss potential updates to the robot exclusion list, but we're also looking at devising a set of dynamic algorithms that would allow us to identify robotic behavior where it's a bad robot and it's not declaring itself properly, or somebody's trying to do something evil, spamming, hacking, dictionary attacking, and so on. This is always an ongoing task and always will be, because as we move to cleverer filtering, you can guarantee that the bad robots and rogues will change the way they behave and try and make it even more difficult for us to detect them. However, we do hope one day to sort of beat them into a point of submission where their level of activity has to be so low that it's just going to be a little bit of noise instead of a major irritation when trying to work out what is a true stat and what isn't. The service itself, yes, okay. First and foremost, for an individual repository, it gives you some stats that you can rely on as consistent, and you know how they've been produced. It's all on a transparent basis. But beyond the individual repositories, as I said before, you can also then open up the possibilities of comparing across organisations, nationally and internationally, benchmarking, and so on. I quite like this slide. It's a useful quick glance to see the major stakeholders that could have an interest in IRUS services, and just to quickly say, if I'm a repository manager, what do I want to do? Well, with my repository, I want to identify trends, patterns, report to my management team, and then benchmark my IR against another institution's repository or against a bunch of repositories. For individual researchers, the opportunity to, as I say, as we increasingly get hold of ORCIDs, to produce reports for researchers so that they can see what the usage and impact of their research is, and as I mentioned, also that usage could be reported to funding bodies. Funders, likewise, they potentially benefit from being able to demonstrate the impact of their funded research. And indeed, suppliers of related products can also be stakeholders. ePrint software, typically ePrint repositories will use or have used IR Stats or IR Stats 2. And in the last few months, we've had a good number of conversations with the IR Stats team, and they are in fact in the process of harmonizing their processing of data into stats to fall in line with us and Counter, which is very encouraging. Clearly, as we move beyond thinking about individual repositories or individual nations, there's the possibilities for say a wider picture of some kind of global aggregation of usage stats around institutional repositories. And open access publishers also, clearly, they will host an article, but also it may well be hosted on a repository, and of course it's of interest and to their benefit if they can find out about usage of an article that they host that is hosted elsewhere. I think I'm done.
Yes, thank you so much. So if you'll stop sharing and kick it over to me. Thank you. Both terrific. All right. So I think, are you seeing my slides now? Yes. Yes, I'm seeing yes. Okay, good. All right, so we thought that we would conclude just by offering a few of the questions that are animating us as we assess the success and value of the pilot and figure out how we might take it forward. So I'll just run through them quickly. First, obviously, we are trying to determine whether there's an appetite for a national or perhaps a North American service like this among DLF's membership and more broadly. We're wondering whether use cases that have developed in the quite sophisticated and big IRUS UK conglomeration, whether those are broadly applicable internationally, and thinking about how the community might see value in a project like this, value in comparing statistics across institutions, value in looking internationally, or whether there's interest in using a system like this, especially at special moments or in advocacy contexts like OA Week, which is something that we've heard from pilot members. Can we usefully align this work with AIG projects and with wider DLF community projects and interests? You heard about the AIG reuse project. There's also coming from and involving institutions in our membership and beyond the RAMP project, which is a Google Analytics-based approach to doing some similar things, and all the projects that we're from the AIG and elsewhere in the DLF community that we're hoping to pull together in a kind of dashboard approach. How might DLF and JISC work together to make a service like this sustainable? That's probably the biggest one for us going forward. So yeah, those are our questions. We would welcome your responses to any of those. Your reflections on your experience with IRUS USA, if you happen to be part of the pilot, or just general questions and comments. And so I'll encourage you just to unmute yourself and chime in. And please introduce yourself in asking if you don't mind. So now comes the long, awkward pause.
So this is Santi, again, University of Houston, AIG, all that fun stuff. I'm curious, because I think I heard parts of this. So this is as a pilot participant who's interested. Particularly Paul, you had mentioned about the sort of power of ORCID and the opportunities it's going to present maybe for exposing data to researchers. If I heard that correctly, but maybe not. So I'm sort of curious to know from the JISC side, either from existing use cases or from potential future ones, what are the abilities to communicate out these sort of refined usage statistics to the users who, or to the authors who have content in these various repositories? And are you aware of any groups that are actively doing that and doing it sort of in an automated way, or is this by request? How does that work?
Hi, yeah. In IRUS UK, there are a couple of new options available in the drop-down menus. There's a view that just gives an overview of the ORCID stats, of how many we've got, how many items they apply to for which repository. But we also have an ORCID author browse, and we've added the ability to search by ORCID. So anybody, although of course we're behind SHIB, it's not tied down so that only some people can see some bits and so on. So any researcher whose ORCID we have obtained and is in our system can either browse to him or herself, or do a search on their own ORCID. And if we do know about them, it will produce an overview of all the articles and other items of theirs that we know about, and give an overall usage figure for stuff that they've authored. Does that help?
It does. And do you give them that information when they direct you directly? Can they contact you directly?
It's still in its infancy.
Okay.
At the moment, we've harvested the ORCIDs from 2 of our participating repositories, and we're hoping to pick up a few more. We are trying to promote the use of ORCID in the UK. So at the moment, my feeling is it's not getting a huge amount of use yet, but then it is in its infancy, and I think probably we have some work to do, and individual repository managers and so on, as you know, they make their ORCIDs available to us, they could inform their researchers that they can go in and see stuff that is guaranteed to be specific to them.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you for that. I think that's an exciting element that many of our stakeholders would find valuable.
Yeah, I'd also say at this stage, clearly what we've done is what we've identified as something basic and useful. But in my experience, when you make something new available to people, after a while they start coming back with other ideas for what you could be doing with it, and that's the bit that we're really looking forward to. Not just what we've done, but come on, hey, come back to us, and we'll develop stuff around what you want. That's the IRUS ethos. We've always sort of relied on the community to guide us in what we do.
It's Ross. Can I just add something to that? Because on the basis of what Paul just said there, when we were rolling IRUS out, it was basically an enabling technology, and it was interesting to see and capture the use cases for how it fired up people's imagination. So you'll see one of them is at Imperial College, and they, on a monthly basis, put on the blog the amount of activity that their repository sees in terms of article downloads, but also theses and dissertation downloads, and they use that as a promotion for recruiting, postgraduate researchers. They also flag up on a monthly basis the top 5 or so articles downloaded and inform the academic who's authored or co-authored the piece themselves. So it's a bit like Employee of the Month. But, it's there in support of OA advocacy generally.
Hi, it's Hilary. Just adding on to what Paul and Ross have just said. A lot of the information we provide goes back to the people who man or manage the institutional repository itself, and they want to promote things up to their managers or senior managers, vice chancellors or whoever, in a very, very a nice image and very short attention span. So them looking at the information we provide then gives them ammunition, if you like, to show how important the repository is, whether that's by individual researcher or author or whatever. It just promotes the repository itself as well.
I want to pass on a couple of questions that Hannah has put into chat, Hannah from University of Iowa, and I think we've been maybe in part addressing the first one. She asks, I'm curious as to how IRUS UK has been used to encourage use of collections. I think we've started to get at that. But another set of questions from Hannah. How closely are you all working with the various institutions to harvest their data? How much jigging of institutional data has been needed in order to effectively aggregate in IRUS? I'm thinking of the labor involved as a participating institution. Yeah. So maybe if one of you could talk a little bit about what it takes to get into IRUS?
Yeah. Well, as I say, the key thing to participating in IRUS is to have a little bit of software added to your repository software, a little bit of code that does all the heavy lifting, sending the messages to IRUS. For an ePrints repository, it's well, actually nowadays, because it's available in ePrints Bazaar, it's a few minutes work to enable IRUS functionality. For DSpace, it's patches, and it varies. Of course, DSpace can be customized a lot. The more customized it is, the more work perhaps to apply that piece of code. But generally, half a day for the average DSpace repository, and for others, we've also worked with other bespoke software and others like Figshare and Elsevier's Pure Portal. I'm not sure how much it took, development time it took Elsevier, but basically that IRUS functionality ships with Pure now, so it's there. It's just a matter of turning it on in config. Once the data's coming to us, how much an institution wishes to engage and how much time they spend with us, well, most repositories, it's just a case of get into IRUS and see your stats. Hardly any jigging of institutional data needed in order to effectively work with IRUS. We have a few examples where one of the key identifiers of articles for us is the DOI, and that's very, very important identifier for being able to match items across different repositories and different platforms. And in a couple of cases, we've had institutions come back to us and say, "Oh, look, it looks like we haven't got any DOIs, but we know we've been putting them in." It usually turns out to be, although they're within the database of the individual repository software, they haven't necessarily got their OAI interface configured to expose the DOI. And typically, to make an OAI feed show the DOI, if it's been missing, or ISSNs, or occasionally other fields, it's usually only a few minutes work. So the labour involved for a participating institution, if they don't really want to do any hard work but just want to get the stats, there's really not any labour involved. I should add, we do try as much as possible to work with standards around metadata in everything we do. So because we use the OAI PMH as the method of getting our metadata, generally it's no work at all.
And there's another question in the chat from Jenya. How, following up on Hannah's question, can you talk a little bit about how you map to the Counter 5 IR multimedia report? Are there any item type issues that you're running into?
Well, as Dave showed, we do map the thousands of different individual item types. I mean, they're not really thousands. It's just, you know, for an article, one place will define the item type as article, another will call it journal article, others might call it research paper. There are a multitude of types, and amongst our mappings, we do also map to a couple of multimedia categories. Do we run into issues? Not really, no. We do have to curate our item type mapping regularly, and Hilary and I work regularly each month to update the item type mappings, especially as new repositories join us, and there are subtle differences in the way they've labelled what is an article or a multimedia item. But showstopper type issues, no. I'm confident that we'll be able to produce the IR multimedia report, as well as the IR article report and a master. Also, Counter R5 reports, Counter R5 has been designed to be extensible. So in addition to the master reports and the standard views, we can also define custom reports built around the atomic counter stats. So it's very flexible and very easy, I would say.
So we are just past the top of the hour, and I think we probably have time for one more question if there is one. So I'll pause for a second to see if anybody wants to ask. And there's some enthusiasm about the Counter 5 release in the chat.
Yay.
And if not, then I just want to thank everyone who's contributed to the webinar today, and most especially to the pilot project, from the folks at JISC who have done all the heavy lifting on making this possible, to the institutions that were willing to come along for the experiment. We're so grateful to you. What I have up on the screen right now is a little survey, if you have a moment to take it, not about the pilot itself. We'll be circulating some assessment instruments to the pilot group through the Google group that you're all a part of, but just about the webinar. And then also on the screen, you see 2 email addresses. The first is to contact us at DLF if you're not currently part of the pilot and you're interested in learning more. And the second is that help desk email address that Paul mentioned earlier. So if you are part of the pilot and and have a question for JISC, or if you're just interested in the broader IRUS project and want to get in touch with them, that's an address for you. And so I'll just say thank you and goodbye, everybody.